So, as we continue in our story of Genesis, let's just get back to Genesis 40 and 41. We're right in the middle of the life of Joseph, and we're going to continue talking about his narrative. So, his brothers have sold him into slavery, just as a recap. He's had some dreams before getting there. He's gone to Potiphar's house, he's been falsely accused, and so he's moved from slave to imprisoned. So, and they've now entrusted him also with helping manage the prison. He's still a prisoner. He has no freedoms, but at least this is an elevated place. He can help with other prisoners, probably food, all those different things that he needs to do to keep himself safe and alive at this point. So we're going to jump back into Genesis 40, where he's at, and just start to see, especially in these next couple of narratives, how important dreams were in this cultural time, how much they understood how to deal with them. Like I said earlier, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, all of these lines had always talked about dreams. They'd had it as part of their culture. It was part of what they were doing in the Old Testament. It's the way God was speaking to them. God was speaking to Abimelech, a foreign king. So it wasn't an expectation that God would only speak to the people in the covenant line, but he was willing to speak to others through dreams. And we remember, too, that they took dreams really seriously. That's why Jacob renamed the place Bethel when he saw the ladder with the angels ascending and descending to heaven. We also see that in Joseph. His brothers took it so seriously, they sold him into slavery. So again, just showing how important dreams are, that this is a culture for them. This is part of, an oral culture of stories and talking and describing what's gone on. And you can just kind of see family life. He was willing to share his dreams with his brothers and those types of things. So again, that's just the background. So as we step into these next few areas, let's just realize that is already kind of the understanding, is that God speaks in dreams. Sometimes they're figurative and symbolic, and other times they're very literal. The one with Jacob, he hears God speaking to him in that about the angels ascending and descending. It's very much more of like a very literal dream to him. Where Joseph, it was sheaves of wheat bowing down to him, to his, and the sun, moon, and stars bowing down to him. So again, that's a lot more figurative. You have to actually interpret it. You have to have an interpretation. And we'll see here that Joseph regularly says God is the interpreter of dreams. So it's not up to man. It's not up to people to decide what they mean. It's really up to God. Since he's the giver of the dreams, he's going to be the interpreter. So we're going to see that theme as well. And I think this is an important thing that we just keep seeing in the life of Joseph, is his focus back up on God. When everyone around him, right? There's no church to go to. Nobody will hold him accountable. Everything's going wrong. There are only pagans around him that don't know God. And yet he's the one there, and he's able to stay steadfast. We'll see something sort of similar with Daniel, but Daniel did have some friends and other people in exile. Joseph's really alone here. Okay, so verse 1 of Genesis 40, it says, "Then it came about after these things that the cupbearer and the baker for the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was furious with his two officials. Was the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. So he put them in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard in the prison, the same place where Joseph was imprisoned." So this kind of tells you where Joseph's imprisoned. He's imprisoned in a place probably for like political captives. And being the baker and the cupbearer for a king is an important position. They're the ones that are going to keep the king from getting poisoned, right? They're kind of his security guards. And so in our day and age, this would be like the head of security for a president or something like that. This is a really elevated thing. This isn't just someone who bakes in a kitchen. The cupbearer for sure is almost like your food taster, the one that's making sure that nothing's going to come before the king, because really his life's on the line if someone tries to poison the king. So these are both very elevated roles, and they get sent to prison. And Joseph's in that same prison. Remember, because Potiphar was a highly elevated official, so when he sent someone to prison, it was the same prison. The two men had offended the king. So this just tells you the time and the place that Joseph is going to later be in one of these kinds of positions under the king, knowing that at any point, if the king or the pharaoh doesn't like you, so I'm using those words interchangeably, king or pharaoh of Egypt, he can send you back to prison. And so again, we have the cupbearer and the baker that both offended the king, and here they end up in prison. So we do talk about Joseph being freed from prison, but there's always that threat of being sent back immediately if he does anything the king doesn't like, especially if you interpret the dream the wrong way. And we'll also see that this king is going to actually kill one of the baker or the cupbearer here. So this is a pretty tough position to be in. We'll see other cupbearers in the Bible, people like Nehemiah and others. We'll see Daniel kind of working in a highly elevated role under a pagan king as well. And so again, there's much influence in these roles, but there's not a lot of necessarily self-autonomy of power and authority. Joseph couldn't leave the land unless he asked Nehemiah. It's the same thing. So again, they were in a certain sense still in bond slaves in a certain sense. They weren't prisoners, but it wasn't always the best role. So the prison here is called the house of the captain of the bodyguard. So again, it probably was a fortress of some sort, a very guarded place. And this prison that Joseph is in, right, they can't leave. And it really is functioning like a prison. So what happens once these two come into Joseph's world? We go to verse 4. It says, "And the captain of the bodyguard put Joseph in charge of them, and he took care of them. And they were in confinement for some time. Then the cupbearer and the baker for the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, both had dreams the same night, each man his own dream, and each with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning and saw them, behold, they were dejected. And he asked Pharaoh's officials who were with him in the confinement in his master's house, 'Why are you sad-faced today? Why are your faces so sad today?' And they said to him, 'We have had a dream, and there is no one to interpret it.' Then Joseph said to them, 'Do interpretations not belong to God? Tell it to me, please.'" So we get the sense here that they're sad, they're in prison, they've had these disturbing dreams. Disturbing meaning they don't understand them. Maybe they weren't terribly disturbing in having them, but just the fact that they had dreams. This culture obviously understood that dreams were important. This wasn't something they just woke up and went, "Oh, I had a dream, no big deal." They knew that these dreams had something to them. They're probably sad and dejected because they wanted them interpreted. And in that culture, they would have gone to a pagan priest or temple, probably to have these interpreted, or would have had the ability to access those people when they'd been in those elevated roles. And now they don't. They don't have access, and they don't have the freedom. So how are they going to get these dreams interpreted? And Joseph goes, wait, if they're really dreams from God, God is with us, like is with me, and we interpret the dreams. And so again, we don't see this being an issue when Joseph wakes up and he tells his brothers. They just all knew that what the interpretation was, even though it was very symbolic. So here, Joseph is going to interpret two dreams. He'd had true dreams previously. They're going to have two dreams, and the Pharaoh's going to have two dreams. We're going to see this repeated, and at some point, Joseph will explain what two dreams means. And so we see Jacob, he didn't have two dreams. We had Abimelech, he didn't have two dreams. But here we are seeing this repetition in Genesis. And you'll see that throughout Genesis. There's different things being repeated or emphasized. They were dejected just because they didn't understand. And then Joseph is absolutely correct. It's going to be God that's going to provide these dream interpretations. So in verse 9, we see, "So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph, saying, 'In my dream, behold, there was a vine in front of me, and the vine were 3 branches, and it was budding. Its blossoms came out, and its clusters produced ripe grapes. Now Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, so I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I put the cup into Pharaoh's hand.'" Okay, so in general, this sounds like a pretty good dream, right? Things are growing and budding. Grapes come forward. Pharaoh and this cupbearer are interacting again. I mean, I've got to think that I'm not sure why he would be sad-faced. It seems this one is a little bit more straightforward because this is actually what's going to happen. He's going to be promoted back to holding the Pharaoh's cup and doing that. And so again, even though this is symbolic, this one I think is more straightforward. But it does need a little bit of interpreting. The vine with 3 branches, it seems interesting that this would even be pointed out in such a detail. But that's part of what Joseph's going to interpret, that there are ripe grapes coming forward. And this all had to do with this cupbearer's job, right? His job was to make sure that the king had the right wine and everything to go with his food. And so a cupbearer, this would be something very much part of his life. This wasn't some symbology that he wouldn't have understood. Again, there's a vine with 3 branches and ripe grapes. It's not quite obvious that this is going to mean 3 days. So we'll see how Joseph kind of handles that. That interpretation obviously is straight from God. And so again, this is going to mean to him that he's going to get his job back. But we'll see that in verse 12 and 13. So then Joseph said to him, "This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you will put Pharaoh's cup into his hand, as in your former practice when you were his cupbearer. So basically, you offended him, you've done some prison time, he's going to remember you, and he's actually going to restore you to your position. The part of this dream interpretation that's supernatural has to be those 3 days, right? The 3 vines means 3 days. That's not really apparent. Him being restored to his previous job, that seems like it was kind of directly involved in the dream of having wine and handing it to the Pharaoh. Okay, so again, Joseph then asks, "Only keep me in mind when it goes well for you, and please do not do me a kindness by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For I was in fact kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing that they should have put me into this dungeon." And so again, we see that Joseph does not want to be where he's at. And he is pleading with him. He has faith that God is going to do exactly what he said. In 3 days, this guy's going to get out. He's going to be able to go in front of the Pharaoh. And all I want him to say is, "Hey, I met this guy in prison. Please let him out. He's just unfairly there. If you've been promoted back into your position, maybe I can get a job here too. I've been managing the prison really well. I have some good recommendation letters," right? Like anything you can to get out of prison at this point. And so Joseph is convinced that this interpretation is going to come true. That's why he's sending this message ahead with this guy. He even recounts the original kidnapping. And so as time has gone on, things have just gotten worse. He was kidnapped, he was enslaved, he's imprisoned. Like, this has been kind of a downward slope and trajectory. And Joseph probably has in the back of his mind, what about those 2 dreams I had? In those, I was really, everybody was bowing down to me, and look, here I'm in prison right now. So Joseph's got to think, this has got to end. Like, when is this going to end, God? And he's having belief in dreams still, even though his 2 haven't happened. And it's been a very long time at this point. It's well over a decade since Joseph had those dreams. And then in verse 16, it says, "When the chief saw that he had interpreted favorably, he said to Joseph, I also saw my dream, and behold, there were 3 baskets of white bread on my head. And in the top basket, there were some of all kinds of baked food for Pharaoh, and the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." Okay, so this dream, I am sure that it is not obvious what's going on. It definitely needs an interpretation, which is from God. It may have been just, and we don't see some big interpretation like ritual that Joseph goes through. He doesn't go on a 3-day fasting or prayer time. He just interprets these in this place, and in this time we'll see the same with Pharaoh. In other times, we will see people take time away to go get an interpretation of dreams. We'll see that with Daniel and other things where they want some time to pray over them and have God give them the interpretation. For Joseph, it seems like this comes pretty quickly in a conversational level. So the last dream had a favorable interpretation. The cupbearer is going to be restored to his position. So the baker's like, okay, well, maybe mine was a good dream too. And so again, we see that in 3 days from now is going to be something that you would never have picked up from this dream outside of a supernatural interpretation. The one thing that might key us off is that the birds were eating the bread, not the Pharaoh. So again, there might have been some sense of birds maybe being a bad sign in a dream, not really sure for them at that time. They may have had some idea. But then Joseph answered and said, "This is the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and will hang you on a wooden post, and the birds will eat your flesh off of you." Okay, so this took a dark turn real fast, right? He's not just saying you're going to die in 3 days. No, your head's going to be lifted up off of you, and you'll hang on a wooden post, and the birds are going to eat your flesh. And we don't know how friendly Joseph was. It doesn't give us any character background. Were these his friends? Were they totally antagonistic towards him? Were they treating him good or bad? We don't know. So that's not really part of this. He's just willing to interpret their dreams. And Joseph here is pretty bold. Like, if you knew that one of the people in prison with you was about to be killed in 3 days, would you be willing to give them this kind of interpretation if you thought that's what it meant? I mean, personally, I don't think most of us have ever been in this situation being like, yeah, you're going to get killed in 3 days. And so this is a very, I would say, bold thing that Joseph does here. He doesn't hold back. He doesn't go, I don't want to tell you that interpretation. Let's give it some time, and say in 3 days, oh yeah, I knew what it meant, but I didn't want to say anything. He has some options here, and he just takes the bold approach of, yeah, this is what's going to happen. So we see a lot of confidence in Joseph and in God and in the way he's hearing God to interpret these dreams. Again, like I said, there may have been some items in here that they might have thought culturally, like birds or something, that weren't good. Again, just from the reading of them, I think these would have had to have been, all these elements would have been interpretations directly from God, because there isn't a lot of, like, to know that this man was going to be put out and hung on a wooden post. That wouldn't have seemed straight from the dream. So without an interpretation. So Joseph doesn't send a plea with this man. He's not going to tell him, hey, when you get out of here, let everybody know about me. He's like, nope, this is what's going to happen, and you're not going to have a voice to do anything about it. So we're going to move on to what happens in verse 20. It says, so it came to pass on the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he held a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his office, and he put the cup into Pharaoh's hands, and he hanged the chief baker just as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So this is kind of the end of this chapter. It's kind of a sad stopping point. Joseph just interpreted 2 dreams, but it's done nothing for Joseph. This is not the way Joseph is going to get out of prison. He's going to have to wait around. We don't know why. What's the point, right? God could have moved at this point, helped the guy remember, helped Joseph get out. We don't know. We don't have all the details all the time. Those are questions we can ask later, but we can't ask them here on earth, right? Why is this taking so long? Is it anything that Joseph's doing that he needs more time in prison? I would say no. We don't really get any sense that the prison time is helping him. Now, granted, Joseph is learning the language. He's getting all the culturalisms. He's learning everything he's going to need for later on to rule. You know, he couldn't have just moved here from his homeland and then come in the next day, interpreted a dream. He really does need to know the culture. He needs to know their systems. He needs to know their language fluently, right? So he can be able to be in the land and help rule it. And so we do see that this time is being used, but again, what's another 2 years in prison going to do for him? It's probably not going to help him. And really, you can learn language and structure of a country and stuff not being imprisoned. So again, this doesn't always seem like plan A from God. We can't really read that into it at all. We just have to say this is what happened. People forgot about Joseph. And he has a choice here again. He can become embittered against these people that forgot him, or he can, he can just let it go. And, you've got to think the whole set of prisoners, probably some of them knew about this dream interpretation and what actually came to happen. So he could have more people asking him for dream interpretations. He could have a whole lot of things going on here. But again, we just don't have many of the details. We don't even get a why or anything like that with Joseph's life. But we do know that through this, we're going to see that his heart is able to accept his brothers back when they come, which means that he has been tending to forgiveness issues and bitterness issues along the way. And so, again, he could be very offended here and hurt. And I'm sure he was probably hurt by this, right? To be left for 2 more years in prison is a long time. But as he works through that, he's probably having to forgive the guy who forgot him again over and over, right? So sometimes the imprisoning comes because somebody actually betrayed him. Other times the imprisoning remains because somebody won't help him. And both of those hurt. And both of those are things that are very real hurts. And like I said, he has the option here of how he's going to respond. So in Genesis 41 and chapter 41, we're going to now step into a different set of dreams. And I love that these are right next to each other because we can just kind of stay on this topic of dreams. Now, it happened at the end of 2 full years. Like I just said, it's been 2 years. Joseph has been in Egypt for 13 years as a slave, servant, and prisoner. He's now 30. He spent all of his adult life as a slave or servant or prisoner. He has been learning a lot. He's been growing in rank in these different places. And now is the change point. And this happens suddenly, right? There's not some lead up. It's not like things are getting better and better. No, things have only gotten worse and worse. I think sometimes we think that, life is going to be like this slow and steady increase or incline. And sometimes it's at the rock bottom when things turn around to the highest point the next day. Like, we can't know the way God works in these things. And so again, Joseph has a faith, and we've seen that faith. Even 2 years earlier, he's sending messages ahead saying, hey, don't forget about me. And so in verse 1, it says that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he was standing by the Nile. And behold, from the Nile, 7 cows came up, fine looking and fat. and they grazed in the marsh grass. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them from the Nile, ugly and thin, and they stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. Then the ugly and thin cows ate the 7 fine-looking and fat cows. Then Pharaoh awoke, but he fell asleep and dreamed a second time, and behold, 7 ears of grain came up on a single stalk, plump and good. And behold, 7 ears, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them. And the thin ears swallowed the 7 plump full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Now in the morning his spirit was troubled, so he sent messengers and called for all the soothsayer priests of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. Okay, so this is an interesting set, right? Pharaoh has 2 dreams. He wakes up, and then he has a second dream. And they both have this same idea. 7 fat cows, 7 lean cows, eat them. 7 big ears of grain, then 7 thin ears come and eat them. And so again, very strange. Cows don't eat cows. Stalks of grain don't eat grain. What does all this mean? And Pharaoh is concerned. He's taking it seriously. He knows this dream has some external or supernatural origin, and he does what pharaohs do in that time. He calls all of the soothsayers and wise men, which means the pagan gods, probably at the temples and, whatever it might have been, the pyramids, whatever they had at this time period, where they were doing their pagan practices to all those Egyptian gods. And I'm sure in history class or something you've learned about those. It was a really, really ugly religion. It was full of idolatry, full of paganism and witchcraft. And he's basically saying, I need them to come interpret this dream because I know it has a divine origin of some sort, or supernatural origin we'll even go with. And so they come, and there's no one who can do this. No one could interpret the dream. They're just stuck. And again, there might be reasons why. If it was a negative dream, maybe they don't want to, or they just don't know. They're trying all their different witchcraft things, and they can't come up with this. All the divinations, anything that they would normally do. And again, like I said, the baker and the wine bearer, the cupbearer, were in prison, and so they had no access at the time to all the soothsayers and pagan rituals and things that they would have thought they needed to do to interpret a dream. And Joseph comes along and goes, no, God's with me. God interprets dreams. I don't do all that. I just ask God. And so if God sends the dream, there's also this side where God needs to be the one that interprets the dream. And so Pharaoh's had what was a God dream. It wasn't inspired by demonic forces or anything else that the soothsayers would have more access to understanding. No, this was by God, and now we need a God person, right, to be able to help Pharaoh out here. And so again, Pharaoh has these 2 dreams. In the past, Abimelech just heard the voice of God when he had a dream, that pagan king in Egypt. And so here, but that was very explicit. God basically just said, this is what's going on, blah, blah, blah. And so God can speak that way. He can speak in very clear ways to people, or he can speak in symbols. And in this case, obviously God's doing something. He wants to speak in symbols, and then he wants to interpret. And this is going to be the perfect setup for Joseph, which God is obviously orchestrating Joseph to move into a place of prominence through this. So again, so here we go. Failed. Everyone's failed. Let's call in somebody else. Let's do something different, right? We see this in the time of Daniel as well. You'll hear these phrases like, and all the soothsayers or wise men of the time could not, tell the dream or interpret the dream or anything like that. In this case, I mean, they've been given the dream. It's not even that they have to come up with the dream. They've been given the dream, and now they're supposed to. So in verse 9 it says, then the chief cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I would make mention today of my own offenses. Pharaoh was furious with his servants, and he put me in the confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard, both me and the chief baker. Then we had a dream one night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now a Hebrew youth was there with us, a servant of the captain of the bodyguard, and we told him the dreams, and he interpreted our dreams for us. For each man he interpreted according to his own dream, and just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. Pharaoh restored me to my office, but he hanged the chief baker. So now, finally, 2 years, and it comes again to the cupbearer, and he remembers. So that message that Joseph sent took 2 years to get there. I don't know if you've ever sent a message somewhere or a letter, and it just takes forever to get there. But 2 years is a very long time. But finally, he comes through, and he says, I met this young youth. He was a Hebrew. He's a foreigner, but he interpreted dreams, and it was spot on. So why don't we have him come in, right? Like, nothing to lose here. You can try. You can send him back to prison. It's kind of probably the thoughts going on. It's been 2 years, and here he comes. So Joseph is described. He's about 28 years old when the baker last saw him, and the chief cupbearer. So again, this is now Joseph at 30, coming before the Pharaoh. So verse 14, then Pharaoh sent the word and called for Joseph, and they hurriedly brought him out of the dungeon. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came to Pharaoh. So it just shows that Joseph was not living in some sort of luxury prison. He had to shave, he had to put on clothing, he had to look appropriate. Shaving probably was more of an Egyptian custom than a Hebrew custom. Those types of things, he probably also needed to put on some sort of clothing that was appropriate for going before a pharaoh. Even though he had that good role as a prison manager, it still didn't come with enough perks that he was dressing well or being given certain privileges like shaving and taking care of things. So again, we see him becoming appropriate for the Egyptian culture and getting ready to go before Pharaoh. We see something similar in the story of Esther. She has the beauty treatments and all the things that were very accustomed to that time and for the court people. So verse 15, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, but no one can interpret it. And I've heard it said about you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph then answered Pharaoh saying, it has nothing to do with me. God will give Pharaoh an answer for his own good. So again, Joseph is always pointing to God. He's going to give God the credit for this over and over and over again. And even though he does, he's still going to get promotion. He doesn't say, oh, it was God that did it, and therefore you shouldn't promote me. He doesn't say that. He just flows with whatever God tells him. He seems like a very bold person, right? To tell someone they're going to die and how they're going to die 3 days later, that's very bold, especially when they're calling him a youth. That means that the cupbearer and the baker, having such privileged positions before, probably very much knew that they outranked Joseph by a lot. He was a foreigner. He was young. And so to be able to be that bold, and now he's having to be bold again with the Pharaoh. And so here we go with, basically, I'm not going to read this. It's verses 17 through 24. You can read those. But the Pharaoh's just going to recount the dreams and just say, none of the soothsayers can explain this to me. So again, like I said, it was seven fat cows get eaten by 7 lean cows, 7 heads of grain get eaten by 7 very withered things of grain. So again, very weird, right? If somebody came to you and said, oh, I had this dream about cows, and there are 14 cows in it, and 7 of them were big and fat, and 7 of them were skinny, and they came and ate each other, what do you think it means? You'd probably tell them, I think you shouldn't eat pizza that close to bedtime, right? Like, there's just these things that we think, well, maybe that wasn't God. And Joseph is understanding this is God. So Joseph hears the dreams. We're not told any of thing that goes on from there, and he's just expected to interpret them, where everyone else has failed. And you've got to think his life's on the line here. He probably hadn't been here before. This isn't a place he was accustomed to. I've got to think this is taking a ton of courage. He's got to have some fear here. He's got to have to step through all of that. And Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. God has told to Pharaoh what he is about to do. So Joseph goes, you had 2 dreams, but, it was for emphasis. And Joseph will say why in a little bit, that's actually the case, that it's a sure thing because there were 2 dreams. And he does affirm, yes, it's God that was speaking to you. It wasn't, somebody, one of the gods you worship or know, it was God, the God I know. And so he said the 7 good cows are 7 years. Okay, so again, it's a time frame. The last one, it was 3 days. This time it's years. There's no way you would know that from a dream, that it was year scales or day scales or anything, even with the numbering. And so again, just that these interpretations are supernatural, right? I'm just saying that because if I wrote these down and you never read them in the Bible and didn't know the interpretation, this is not what would have come to mind. I am almost convinced. And then the 7 good years are 7 years. The dreams are one and the same. The 7 thin and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 more years, right? And so again, there's going to be this thin ears, and they're scorched by the east wind, which means it's going to be a famine. So he knew that this had to do with their food. The cows were things they ate, and so was grain. Again, that's important. He would have understood that from where they've been living. It is, as I have spoken to Pharaoh, God has shown Pharaoh that what he is about to do. Behold, 7 years of great abundance are coming in all the land of Egypt, and after them 7 years of famine will come, and all the abundance will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will ravage the land. So the abundance will be unknown to the land because of that subsequent famine, for it will be very severe. So basically, if the Pharaoh hadn't had an advisor and someone that could interpret this dream, they probably would have lost their whole country, right? Like this famine's coming, and when good years come, people tend to sell off all the extra grain. They use it up. You just become, and this happens. We see this even now when businesses or churches come into this time of abundance. They tend to overexpand, and then thinking it's going to remain, and then you come into some hard years and there's nothing stored up to get through that. So Joseph's like, no, this is a time to really take stock of what you have and understand that you're going to have 7 really good years to prepare you to get through 7 really hard years. So Joseph has an immediate interpretation. He has this immediately. There's 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. This means the famine's not a judgment of God, but a natural event, right? God's giving them a preparation. He's not saying you need to repent or the famine's coming. He just says this is going to happen. God is warning them about its arrival and giving them time to prepare. And I think this is something important to understand, that we need to understand sometimes that certain large-scale events that we might call, God events, right? They aren't. They're part of our natural processes and systems. Other times, God does send famines and exiles and all kinds of things to people groups because of judgment. But he always sends a message of repentance. There's no message here of repentance. This is just a fact. This is actually a redeeming and saving preparation set of messages, right? So we have basically a dream and an interpretation acting like a prophecy. So, and Joseph is kind of acting as the prophet or the intermediary to the voice of God here and helping them understand. And he's not bringing a message of repentance. Probably easily could. They're pagan. They're not doing anything that's godly. But it's not. It's just saying God wants to bring protection. And from what we understand from this, God wants to actually bring protection for Joseph's family, the promised family. They're going to go through the famine as well. This is like, they're going to call it a worldwide famine. The whole area, many nations around are going to go through this famine. And God is trying to protect Joseph and his family. And he's going to use a pagan king and his nation to do it. Now, why they couldn't have a pagan king in Canaan do this, we don't know. But in Egypt, it's going to work. They're going to be able to, set up this system and make it through. So verse 32, now as for the repeating of the dream to Pharaoh twice, it means that the matter is confirmed by God and God will quickly bring it about. So Joseph is saying the 2 dreams are the same. They're saying the same thing. And that means they're confirmed and they're going to quickly happen. Well, let's just go back a minute. Joseph had 2 dreams on the same theme that meant the same thing. The sheaves of wheat bowing down and the sun, moon, and stars bowing down. And yes, it was confirming that God was going to do it. Joseph still hasn't seen that happen. So he has a trust in God and in this interpretation that are beyond his experience. He also, we see that it did not quickly come about in Joseph's case. So it doesn't always mean just because there are 2 dreams right next to each other that mean the same thing, that it's going to quickly happen. In Joseph's case, it's been, we're at age 30. He was like 13. It's been 13 years here. So at least since his dreams. So that did not quickly come about. But for Pharaoh, this will quickly come about. So Joseph's correct. I'm just saying, if we see something confirmed by 2 dreams, we can't just say, oh, it always is that it's going to happen immediately. Well, for Joseph, maybe immediately meant that he was immediately sold into slavery, but that's not the setup, and he wouldn't have known that at this point that the bowing down was going to happen. The bowing down actually takes 22 years before it happens. That is a very, very long time, because we're going to get through the 7 good years and then have a few bad years before his brothers even show up. So Joseph still has quite a ways before his dreams are going to be fulfilled, probably closer to 10 years more. And so now let Pharaoh look for a man discerning and wise and appoint him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh take action to appoint overseers in charge of the land, and let him take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt as a tax in the 7 years of abundance. Then let him collect all the food of the good years that are coming in, and store up the grain for food in the cities under Pharaoh's authority, and have them guard it. Let the food be used as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which will occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land will not perish during the famine. So again, this is just a long narrative. to explain. So Joseph is now no longer interpreting the dream, right? We have the dream, which is the actual giving of the dream. Then we have the interpretation of the dream. And now we have an application. Joseph is now acting like a wise man, a discerning and wise person that says, hey, there needs to be some action taken on this particular dream because you have to actually partner into the saving up of the grain for those 7 years. So you'll have something left in the other 7. And so in this, we go from the actual like giving of the dream. And we see this a lot of times. And that's part of a dream, right? There's 3 places we can go wrong. We can go wrong in the reception. So maybe we didn't hear it right or we didn't receive it quite right. We can get it wrong in the interpretation, which is usually part of the problem, right? Or in the application. What do I do with this? I've seen it go, usually the application is the hardest piece. I've had people say, oh, I saw in a dream that these 2 people were going to get married. And then, so I should go help them get, and then you find out, well, that takes human willingness. They need to go through counseling. They've got a lot of issues to work out. Yeah, that's best. I understand that's what we want. But then again, there's people involved. Here, it's a little different because the application is based on a dream that God's going to do something out of that interpretation, right? God says, there's going to be this famine. Get ready for it. Now, on the other side, God could have just stopped a famine, and all these weather problems, right? He's the one that sends rain. We know that from other Bible verses. But he decides to do this differently. He decides to give this interpretation and show himself as God in front of Pharaoh and all the people of Egypt and save his covenant people through this means. So instead of sending them rain or something special, he decides that this is how it's going to go. And so that we see God regularly interacting in human history here. He's not going to change the weather pattern. He's just going to allow this to happen, and he's going to give Pharaoh a dream and then allow Joseph to give this application. So the application is basically save up in the good years, a bunch of food, so at least you'll have something in the bad years, right? You're going to have more than enough in the good years. They can sell it, they can use it. So Joseph moves from the interpretation to application, and he's showing he's kind of this priestly intermediary to God. He's a wise man. He's giving counsel now. Now that's pretty bold to give counsel to Pharaoh. He doesn't just walk away and say, oh, it's your land, it's your problem, you're in authority, do what you want. I think he realizes at this point that the application is just as important. So he basically tells them, take 20% as a tax these next 7 years in the grain. And then that 20% tax is all they're going to have those next 7 years. And so they can use 80% in years 1 through 7, and then they'll have 20% in years 8 through 15 or 14. So he's basically giving this idea that, 80%, they're going to just still feel like abundance. And then the 20% is enough to get you guys by. You'll be able to stay alive. And so again, this is how he says, now you could have seen it going like, why don't you save up 50%? Well, I don't know if they could build storehouses and all that. It might logistically be hard to also get 50% away from the people. So he's going to tax them. And then we're going to see that he basically, Pharaoh becomes very rich through this. That 20% tax at the time doesn't seem like the people rebel against it in those 7 years. And then by the end of it, he's going to be able to use this kind of against the people. And now the proposals seem good to Pharaoh and to all his servants. The wisdom is recognized. His plans and administration are of much value. Joseph is now seen as a very wise person. And besides, Joseph has just said, let's see a 20% tax increase, right? Like, this isn't going to bother Pharaoh. He's getting something out of this anyway. And so for him, this is all very positive. Now, you've got to think the people in the land are going to hear this. Why they're not saving up their own amount of 20% grain, taxing 20%, maybe saving some of their own. They don't. They seem to kind of use it up because they're going to have to come to Pharaoh and sell everything they have to get grain from him. So again, nobody else seems to be taking this very seriously. Pharaoh does, but it's also in his best interest just to store up all this grain anyway. So the Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom there is a divine spirit? So they recognize that there's something going on with Joseph, that he has a spirit of God with him, or a divine spirit with Joseph that's different than all their other gods. This is a miraculous interpretation. He seems to have not only interpretation, but wisdom with it. He's giving counsel and boldness, right? We see this kind of also in the ministry of Jesus, where there's just a boldness. The scribes look at him and go, well, you're not just reading the scripture like we do. You're actually like interpreting and giving commentary and direction with it. And so Joseph is is acting in this boldness of God. So they're noticing the Spirit. Joseph has done well to point to God as the interpreter of dreams and continues to give God the credit, and they're understanding that it is God that they don't know. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has informed you of all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you are. You shall be in charge of my house, and all my people shall be obedient to you. Only regarding the throne will I be greater than you." Pharaoh also said to Joseph, "See, I have placed you over all the land of Egypt." So Joseph is now the tax collector, 20% a year on these abundant years. The people are going to now owe to Joseph, and he's going to be over the household of Pharaoh, and he's going to have all of this. So he's gone from prison to second in command in Egypt. Now, like I said, he doesn't have full freedoms. The Pharaoh can do whatever he wants to him at any point in time. We've already seen what can happen. So there's got to be a sobering to Joseph. He's seen the good and the bad of being one of Pharaoh's higher up men. The baker had his head taken off and was put on a post to be eaten by birds. So I'm sure that was always in Joseph's mind. Like, you can't make him mad. You've got to do things that are appropriate. And so Joseph is going from prison to high-ranking official because of God's favor. And we've seen this favor on Joseph's life. His father had a ton of favor on him, gave him a special coat. His brothers hated him for it. And we know that this can stir up issues. He's had favor in Potiphar's house, which again stirred up issues with Potiphar's wife. And so we just continue to see that. We see that God is kind of restoring Joseph to a role that we've seen other people kind of hold, this kind of prophetic administrative role. We'll see Daniel hold something similar where he is. In verse 42, then Pharaoh took off his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold necklace around his neck. So the signet ring of a pharaoh would have the authority. It would be, his stamp, his seal for his house. Multiple officials would have had them, but Joseph gets one. So it's not that this was the only one, but this kind of gives him authority. It gives him ability to work for the king out of this household. The gold chains were given at this time period as royal appreciation. Gold necklaces, what those would have looked like. You can go back and look at some of the Egyptian pictures and things of this time and get a feel for what kind of neckwear they wore and those kinds of things. And then fine linen was part of the court dress. So he was dressed appropriately. He was brought into the court. Even though he was a foreigner, he's been given all of this. Like, they don't worry he's a spy or anything else. He's just there, and he's ready to serve them. And again, so in verse 43, and he had him ride in his second chariot, and they proclaimed ahead of him, bow the knee, and he placed him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, though I am Pharaoh, yet without your permission, no one shall raise his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. So Joseph was very respected, right? He kind of gets a parade. He gets installed. This is a big deal. And it's not a secret thing. This is done publicly and openly. So in verse 45, then Pharaoh named Joseph a new name, and he gave him his daughter, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. So Joseph is given a foreign wife. She is the priest's daughter, so would have been deeply steeped in pagan worship. Again, we're not told much more about details about her. She's very much deeply committed into Egyptian deities. We don't know what kind of spiritual conflict that would have brought into his home. But again, there's no spiritual or moral comment given on the situation. Joseph just seems to accept her as his wife. And so again, there's a little bit of this arrangement that's going on. Pharaoh's doing this arranged marriage, those kinds of things for Joseph. So now Joseph was 30 years old when he stood in the presence of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During these 7 years of plenty, the land produced abundantly. And so he collected all the food of these 7 years which occurred in the land of Egypt and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from its own surrounding fields. Joseph stored up grain in great abundance like the sand of the sea until he stopped measuring it, for it was beyond measure. So this is a difficult thing, right? He's got to go through an entire nation area and make sure that they have enough holding area. None of them would have been normally holding grain for this long. I mean, we see today that to put in grain storage facilities, it takes a lot of work. And it's hard to manage, right? There's mice, there's rot, there's all kinds of problems and issues with storing grain that have to be taken care of. In our day and age, I mean, they use blower systems and air systems and all kinds of things. We have metal tin bins and things like that for grain storage. But you've got to think that Joseph is having to do this on a massive scale, on a national scale, and put in these huge amounts of grain storage and making sure that the grain can last from year 1 all the way through to year 14. He's got to keep grain going. And so you don't want things like mildews and things like that coming in through rains. And so they would have been a huge building project along with all of this. So he is going all over the place. And Pharaoh doesn't have to travel this way, right? He's got this key administrator that's going to take care of everything. The people are getting taxed 20%, and they're accepting that. They're not fighting or rebelling against the Pharaoh. They're just being able to do this. They're probably seeing it go into their storage in their city, which might have helped to know that it was close by, that if they ever needed it, it was going to be there. Joseph is good and hardworking. This is a tough job, right? Implementing a 20% tax and having people not steal it and keep it and guard it and keeping everything else out that needs to. He had to have some really good knowledge of how to take on grain and produce. Like if you put somebody in here that didn't know or didn't have the wisdom to do this, they could really mess this up. So again, verse 50, now before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph, to his wife and him. The first was Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my trouble and my father's household. He named the second Ephraim. He said, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. So basically he's saying, my life's being restored. I have a wife, I have 2 sons, and he names them accordingly, right? He says, God made me forget all my troubles. God has made me faithful in the land. So there's just 2 places he's had a lot of conflict, back in his father's household and in the land. It's a little bit of reminiscent of Jacob, right? He strives with his brother, strives with his uncle. Joseph's got this other thing where the people around him just keep putting him back in prison enslavement. And so he's really dealing with that here. And he's saying, God made me forget it, which means he's been dealing with his heart issues, right? He could be bitter. He could be angry. He could be carrying this on and being like, I was in prison all these years. He says, no, God made me forget all that. I have this child now. That's the first child. And by the second one, he's like, okay, now I'm fruitful even. After all these afflicted years, not only have I forgotten the pain of the past, and, when the blessing comes of God, we have choices at that point. We can accept the blessing, or we can continue to look backwards at all the pain that it took before we got to this place. And Joseph chooses to do this well, right? He's really taking care of his heart. And I think sometimes this is something we need to be very clear, that even when we have a big victory or win, we get that promotion, we still have to realize there was a lot of pain and suffering that came before that needs to be dealt with. And Joseph is letting go of that, and he's doing it well. He's processing it and not just saying, oh, that's in my past, and then, might show up again. He's like, no, I'm really going to deal with this. And we see that as his brothers come into the story later, that he's going to help them. He's going to be able to be present and weep and cry and emotionally not just shut down. And that takes some doing. And so we're seeing as these years, and he's super busy, right? Like, I can't imagine being a busier person than the second in command, having to collect a new, basically set up a whole new tax structure and then store all that tax, grain, all of that comes with it. And he's still able to get his heart right and deal with these things. So verse 53, when the 7 years of plenty which had taken place in the land of Egypt came to an end, the 7 years of famine began to come, just as Joseph had said. Then there was famine in all the lands, but in the land of Egypt there was bread. So again, this happened everywhere. It all happened on the timeline given, exactly God said, exactly as the interpretation. This famine was much larger than just Egypt. It was a massive famine that was going to affect the whole regional area. But God needs to save the promised line. So that's why Joseph's here. And Egypt is fine. They have enough food. Other places don't. So when all the land of Egypt suffered famine, the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said to the Egyptians, go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, you shall do. When the famine was spread over the entire face of the earth, then Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, and the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. And the people of all the earth came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe in all the earth. So again, it may have taken them a year or two before the famine really took off. And at this point, somehow they've been able to guard all this food in all these different areas and not have them overrun. And hungry people are desperate people. And so I'm surprised that the guards were able to hold all the food, but they were. And not only are the Egyptians hungry, but all the people from around there. Again, you would think that they could attack or something. So there had to also be, like it said, there was guards. So he also was over the armed forces and things like that had to keep this working well because you don't want all the food to be, just taken over and pillaged year one. So these had to have been large cities, large storehouses with large guards. And so we see that Joseph was skilled in administration. This is a massive, like I said, a massive project. I don't think I can stress that enough, how much went into this. And so again, Egypt becomes the saving place during a famine. We've seen this before, right? Abraham travels during a famine. Now, again, we're going to see this happen. And so, other times Isaac was told not to go to Egypt during a famine, but Jacob and his family are going to have to come to Egypt for this famine. So it's not always true that one generation is going to have the same requirements or direction as another. They each are going to have to seek God. Abraham was not to be in Egypt. Isaac was not to be in Egypt, but now in Joseph's time, they need to be in Egypt. So again, we just see God having to speak and walk with them. We can't turn things into protocols and legalism. We have to have that relationship with God that saves us during these times of famine and hard things, and really hear God again on where we are with him. And so we see that happening here, that Joseph has a tender heart that can hear God, even through a pagan king's dream. He doesn't just write it off, oh, that's Pharaoh's dream. He's able to interpret it and then run with it. And it's a lot of faith for 7 years to have to go around being the tax collector and really put himself out there, even when, his dreams haven't quite happened yet. He still hasn't had his family bow down to him. And so we will see this continue into the next chapters as we go. But again, like I said, Joseph is just a great picture of giving credit to God and keeping his heart right through all the things that went on in his life.